Hearties and germs, welcome back to Guardbeardia. 'Tis I, the Beldam, with another episode of the Emily Bronze series, this being Chapter 4, Part 2. Turns out we get another part in this. Anyway, on to the story. Emily was having issues being brave for the money. She was able to get to sleep with a bit of liquid courage, but she kept having a new, fresh flavor of hell when it came to her nightmares. Instead of the airport, she was constantly falling out of an airplane. No matter how much she pulled or yanked on her chute cord, nothing happened, and she was constantly falling towards the ground. When she had woken up the morning before her flight, she was drenched in sweat and woke up shivering, having apparently kicked off her comforter during her flailing sleep. She had just barely gotten her breathing under control when Marill began pounding on her door, which rattled harshly from how hard she was excitedly thumping on it. Emily, we gotta go soon! Grab your bag! Let's go! Just a minute, sweet Jesus, you're gonna help me put on my underwear as well? Emily was soaked from head to toe, which was an uncomfortable feeling, and she quickly hopped into the shower to wash away the fear and sweat from her skin. After getting all her kit together and fetching her motorbike, Emily and Marill made off for the airship that was some miles away, the bracing Logan Cache Airport, while Marill trotted at a quickened pace beside her, maintaining speed with the motorbike easily, much to Emily's surprise. She thought over the tips she pulled from feverish Googling the entire night before. Unlike most parachutes, static deployment was an automatic process, in which the parachute was ripped out of its pack so it deployed as soon as possible. For the most part, it was quite safe, with most issues coming from bad packing, bad body position, or just poor equipment. Knowing Jamaisha was the one that packed their chutes gave her some solace. Then again, the tips just said, fall out of the airplane. While the tip was helpful, it was very vague in just what the hell it meant by fall out of the airplane. The sound of aircraft engines began to grow in the distance as they neared the airstrip, and a shadow began to grow up along the road towards them. Emily tilted her head up and saw what seemed to be a bright blue western dragon looming up above the airport, beating its wings hard against the air as electricity began to crackle around its feet. Once enough arcing bolts of light had formed around its claws, the display visors around its neck and face began to light up, and she could even hear its booming voice over her motorbike and the clop of Marilla's hooves.
Roger. Departing. Cleared for 58,000. Climbing straight vertical. Enjoy your coffee.
The dragon began to beat his wings harder and swooped up straight into the sky. Below him, a small cluster of male harpies swirled, having gotten impatient and not waited for him to fully take off, and instead choosing to play around his wing draft. Emily came around the long bend into the main area and followed the signs leading her to the loading area. A human guard at the gate raised his head, then placed a pair of binoculars up to his eyes. Marill and Emily held forward their company patches, and then the gate began to rise. The guard made annotations down on his clipboard as the motorbike and Centaur zoomed past, then clicked the button for the gate to come back down. Finding the aircraft was not hard, as Jamaisha's motorbike was parked alongside what looked like some kind of war relic, which had a skeleton painted on the side and the words "Coffin Car" scrawled below. "Oh, sweet fucking hell!" Emily gasped as she saw the C-119, while Marill whooped and clipped ahead of her, going full tilt towards the aircraft. While Emily had chosen normal clothes, Marill had gone all out on the airborne costume, and looked like a Centaur version of what would have landed behind the beaches in Normandy, bearing the alicorn patch of the 13th Airborne Division on her shoulder. Sitting in a lawn chair plus umbrella besides the aircraft was an elderly Japanese woman, who seemed to have the same taste in clothes as Marill. The woman was wearing what appeared to be a Luftwaffe pilot's uniform, complete with a thick leather jacket, huge front-pocketed pants, and the shiniest pair of black boots Emily had seen in her life. Despite her looks, she seemed to be enjoying a nice drink before the flight while talking to Jamaisha, and Emily quietly hoped it was just a lemonade. Marill went straight to her, shouting, "Cherie, look! We both have the same war!" At which Cherie wiggled out of her chair to give the Centaur a hug. Jamaisha turned and saw Emily puttering his way, and he pointed towards the rear of the C-119, where a platform sat. Emily pulled around the harlot and mounted the platform, squaring herself up onto it to make things as easy as possible for Jamaisha. When she got off her motorbike, her legs were wiggling a bit, and the Big Tin Man noticed.
Hit a pothole on the way here?
Emily looked up at him, down on her knees, and tried to steel herself. Nah, I, banged my knee on the bed this morning. Jamaica began to tink his tongue against his teeth, but began hooking her motorbike to the drop platform.
Make sure you PLF correctly, or else your knee won't be feeling better.
Aha! Yes, my parachute landing fall. Righto! Emily gave Jamaica a light punch on the shoulder, which she instantly regretted as her knuckles bapped against too much steel and not enough cloth. Jamaica tilted his skeletal head, and his glowing right eye moved her way, as the left continued watching his hands.
Yes, precisely. It's quite cool this morning, yet you are sweating profusely. Are you unwell?
Emily had taken off her helmet, yet sweat was coursing down her hair and neck, but she waved it off. Oh, no. Engine must be overheating and was getting hot under me. Jamaica's right eye went purple, looked to her bike, then back to blue and back to Emily's face.
Your motorbike engine is running well under its maximum.
God damn it, I'm fine! Emily hissed and slammed her helmet into her sidecar's trunk. Jamaica stared at her with both eyes for a few beats, his hands unmoving, before he looked down and finished up attaching a motorbike.
Of course. Allow me to get your harness on.
Emily wiped at her face roughly, the sweat soaking into the sleeves of her jacket, and Jamaica began helping her into the parachute harness. He worked away quietly, checking and double-checking the harness and the chute before he quietly murmured,
Did it rain on the way here or something?
Yes, Jamaica, it rained.
Explains all the moisture.
You're pushing my buttons, Tin Man. Emily couldn't see his metal face, but she knew he was grinning on the inside. After he had finished his once-over, he stood before her, crossing his arms.
It is okay to be nervous.
I'm not nervous, I'm hungry, and I haven't had breakfast or my coffee. Jamaica's eyes flicked to purple, and Emily waved her hands in front of his face. Quit scanning me! You're like a worse version of the TSA! Jamaica hissed out in laughter, then ruffled Emily's sweaty hair.
The coffin car has an onboard galley, but I would avoid using it, judging from the scan. Fall well, Emily.
Emily turned on her heel and skulked towards the aircraft, muttering, Fall well, Emily, in a mocking, whining voice. She heard the hissing of Jamaica behind her, felt her face burn, and then heard him begin unloading her motorbike into the C-119. Near where the old woman was sitting, her and Muriel were talking expressively about whatever it was that they were grappling over, and Emily tried to sneak past in order to just board the aircraft. Her presence did not go unnoticed, as she had barely made it halfway up the stairs when Muriel turned and pointed her out. This is Emily, Cherie. It's the one I was telling you about. Cherie straightened her glasses and looked Emily over as she held up her hand and ducked into the aircraft. Ah, the one with the motorbike. I don't know Muriel. She doesn't have the looks of an airborne trooper around her. Nonsense. Agadak said she used to jump recreationally all the time. Probably just not used to jumping out with her motorbike after her. Cherie squinted her eyes towards the now empty stairs and pursed her lips together. Perhaps. Inside the C-119, Emily found a jump seat and plopped into it, looking out the window to the dragon hangars. She thought back to a video she watched online once about the engineering process of making little hangar motels for them. Dragons, like all living things, needed sleep, but found that a lot of the places where they normally rested festooned with humans trying to settle on high ground. They also began working commercially and under private contract, which meant that a lot of the time they were laying over in airports with nowhere to sleep but grassy places outside the strip, or just along the strip itself. Naturally, they did not take kindly to such treatment, being the proud things that they were, and demanded actual lodgings, lest they refused to carry packages. Aircraft could carry some of the materials that were needed around the ruined world, but dragons were far better, faster, and more able to defend themselves when something came out of the sky or from the water. Not all the evil beasties in the world came from just the sea. Some things even lived in the sky, part of neither the Shadow Realm or the Allied Realms, instead seeking to hold sway over the expensive skies above the mighty blue, Without the dragons and their affiliated creatures, things would slow to a crawl, so the humans who ran the companies paid the airports to convert unused hangars into cozy places for the dragons to rest. Emily looked at one now. The interior done up as to resemble a cave, where in the middle great cushions were being fluffed and blown clear of dust. These hangar motels did give more jobs to the extraordinary races, as harpies made good money cleaning up the high places, while the stronger species were able to move and fluff the bedding within. When staring at harpies dusting bored her, she turned and looked around the interior of the little plane. There was, in fact, a small kitchenette inside of it, as well as what looked like simple army bunks. One of the bunks was sagging savagely, and Emily realized that there was a muscular Oni woman resting there and reading the morning newspaper. The Oni was yellow, an unusual color, with chocolate brown hair and a single asymmetrical horn poking out from her bangs. Emily thought she looked kind of like a big, sexy chocolate-dipped banana, but figured it would be odd to say out loud. The Oni didn't really pay her any mind, so she did the same. She turned to look at the rear of the plane and saw that Jamesha was rolling away on his monobike, engine keening into the distance. The airframe suddenly shuddered as Morel trotted up the rear ramp, at which the Oni smacked a button on the wall from her bunk. The teardrop-shaped rear cargo door began to hum as it came up, clicking and hissing when it finally met its mate above. "Morel, I thought that the C-119 had, bulbous butts where the doors were." Morel shook herself happily and turned around to look at Emily. "Nah, not the coffin car. Cherie has mishmashed multiple designs together to keep the bird flying. She used to run it in a slingshot configuration, but kept having harpies fly in and steal rides. So she had Nakata over there graft the rear of a C-119J, which has a nice little door that sucks back into the airframe." Nakata, who heard her name, lifted her muscular yellow hand and gave a cheery wave. Before Emily could ask more questions, a lot of noise came from the cockpit of the craft, and the engines began to churr and puff to life, drowning the interior in noise and vibrating the metal skin of the coffin car. Emily found the jump seat to be far too little seat for her liking, her knuckles gripping dead white on the edges as the aircraft began to navigate the airstrip, taxing along until it was her turn to take off. Morel and Nakata chit-chatted loudly over the roar of the engines, while Emily did her best to keep from spewing all over the floor from nerves. Every time the engine spun up to pull the C-119 across the tarmac, Emily's stomach lurched into her throat and she had to keep from squirting tears from her eyes. The real show came when Cherie began her actual takeoff, and seemed to take some kind of pleasure in roaring full speed down the runway and taking off in almost a vertical, pulling the aircraft into a combat takeoff. Morel whooped and grabbed onto the frame near Nakata, while the Oni herself just held up a single hand, almost nonchalantly resting it on the bunk above so she wouldn't slip out. She didn't even put down the newspaper as the C-119 pitched into the sky, but her black and yellow eyes flicked over to Emily. A grin spread across her lips as she watched Emily pin herself to the back rest of her jump seat, screeching at the sudden hard pitch and immediate climb. Emily could have happily watched the entire plane burn to the ground, and would have thrown the match herself. The only time she had flown was as a child, and it had been a nice, subtle takeoff, the pilot smoothly climbing into the sky, at which the waitress then brought her an apple juice to help her scared tears. There were no smooth pilots or apple juice-bearing waitresses here, just a demon in the cockpit and a literal demon who seemed to be watching her every move. She watched as a tear rolled off her cheek and then fell straight down, falling down towards the rear of the cargo door. Her braided ponytail was dangling past her face as she screamed, and she felt vomit begin to roll up in her throat. In a panic, she looked around for a bag as it came into her mouth, but found none, and instead forcefully swallowed it back down her throat so she wouldn't splash it all over her bike. It couldn't have been more than a couple seconds, but it felt like minutes to Emily, and gradually Cherie rolled into a level climb. Morel was hollering and yelling about how awesome it was, rabbit-punching Nakata in the shoulder. "You get to do this all the time? It's not even fair!" Emily was trying to swallow the last bit of puke down her throat and gasping out for air once her throat was clear. She heaved hard, wiping the snot from her nose and doing her best to get some of it out of her hair as well. The jump seat was barely big enough for a person not wearing a chute, but with Jamesha's chute strapped to her back, Emily had been literally on the edge of her seat the entire ride up in the sky. Morel clumped on back towards her, using the ceiling netting as a handhold to keep her from slipping. How about that, Emily? A combat takeoff. Man, I swear Cherie took us straight up into a 90 on that one. Emily was still trying to fill her lungs with air, as well as biting back against the taste of her own stomach on her tongue. Yeah, a real joy. Can't wait to do it again. Emily found none of this to be particularly joyous, and sat back against the seat, her chest heaving against the harness that ran just under her breasts and across her ribs. She heard 2 hollow thumps as Nakata got down from her bunk, opening what looked like some kind of flight fridge. Emily blinked away what tears were left and focused on the Oni, who was squatting down in front of the fridge and pouring something. Above the crack of her ass, the Oni had a tattoo of a radial engine with spinning props, which on either side were the words "Grip it and rip it" in German Gothic lettering. The Oni didn't seem to wear much besides a pair of baggy trousers, a lower body harness, jump boots, and a tank top. And judging from how low her trousers were riding, she didn't seem to wear underwear either. Emily wrinkled her nose at the thought and kept a tight hold on the frame of her seat, just trying to get her breathing under control. She heard the fridge shut and Nakata's boots thumping her way, and lifted her head back up to see the Oni offering a glass of dark brown liquid to her, to help get the vomit out of your mouth. I didn't vomit, Emily growled, sniffling a little. I know, you swallowed it. Drink. Emily looked from the glass to the Oni before taking it and swallowing it in one pull. If whiskey came in the flavor of motor oil and airplane fuel, she must have tasted it, as it not only burned the taste of vomit out of her mouth, but also the hairs from her nose and the sand from her eyes, clutching the glass. What the fuck is this? Gremlin fuel, Nakata said, laughing. Brewed in an aircraft engine. The hell is wrong with you people? Fly your tramp stamp over here and get me some water before I start farting flames. Nakata chuckled, and with a wiggle of her hips, she walked away. Handed Maril her own glass before grabbing a small bottle of water and tossing it at Emily. Maril sipped at her own gremlin fuel as Emily caught the bottle and ripped the cap off of it, drinking greedily to try and put out the fire that was raging in her stomach. After the drink, things leveled out, and Emily had to admit the hard liquor was calming her nerves a fair margin. The in-flight snacks were abysmal, and were mostly Maril pulling out a pair of pre-packed meat sticks from her saddlebag and offering her one. The coffin car buzzed through the calm air just as it would any normal day of travel, and the hours roared by with relative ease. Emily had actually fallen asleep at some point, her head lolling on the back of her jump seat, and was awoken by the sudden rush of air from the C-119. The J-style rear door had been wound back, exposing the rear of the plane to the sky. Maril was double-checking her reserve chutes in front of Emily, and smiled down at her with bright teeth. Hey, buddy, we're about 5 minutes from my jump. Oh, shit. Right, I have to jump out of this thing, Emily remarked, and stood, wobbling on her knees. Maril and Nadaka thought she was making a joke and laughed, going about their pre-drop duties. As Emily stared around blearily, Nakata walked up to her harness now attached to a safety line hanging from the ceiling. You'll be jumping out after your bike and before Maril. Please get in the jump order and attach your static line. Emily blinked at her, squinting from the bright light pouring in from the rear door, and Nakata clicked her teeth. The Oni reached over Emily and grabbed her static line hook, placing it in her hand. Go hook up! Pretend you know what you're doing, Emily thought and stood, getting in between her bike and Maril. Maril had 2 lines going up to the aircraft main line, one of each of her chutes, and Emily reached up, clicking hers onto the same line. She held onto the static line to her D-bag, and Nakata came up behind her, checking her bag and making sure all was in order. Finding everything to be in order, the Oni gave Emily's cheek a little pinch before leaning down and yelling into her ear. You are very cute! Don't go splat on the ground so you can come back and stare at my tattoo! Fuck you! Emily yelled back, and Nakata laughed, working her way forward to hook up the chutes to her bike. Emily kept her eyes staring out into the far ground below, and once again felt the burn of the gremlin fuel still chugging away in her stomach. Emily took a few tentative steps forward, stepping up onto the platform of her motorbike to get more view of the ground. It seemed like they were so far up, but she could still see houses and trees passing along clearly below. Nakata was leaning out of the rear door, idly swinging back and forth as the wind whipped around her clothing. Sometime during the flight she had put her harness on the entire way, now wearing it properly around her shoulders. Emily thought of doing the same and clung on tighter to her static line. Minutes passed, and a bright red light flared to life on the side of the ramp along the door. Nakata looked down at the light and held up a single finger to the occupants of the coffin car, and Emily heard Muriel begin to whoop again behind her. Before Emily could fully understand what was going on, the light then suddenly turned green, and Nakata threw a small bundle out of the rear of the cargo door. The chute furled to life instantly, and the platform of the motorbike gave a sudden jerk. Emily, following natural reactions of the body, reached down and grabbed the back of her sidecar with one hand while the other held on to her static line. "Woo, yeah! Safe it out, Emily!" Emily whipped her head around to see Muriel giving her 2 thumbs up, then whipped it back around to see Nakata sticking out the tip of her tongue and also giving her a thumbs up. "Oh, shit," Emily breathed, and a heartbeat later the motorbike began sliding out of the rear of the door. As if a rocket had suddenly lit behind it, the drag chute ripped the motorbike out of the plane, and Emily had enough time to turn her head and lock eyes with Nakata on the way out. The Oni gave her a cheeky salute before the platform of the bike slipped out from under her feet, and Emily was hanging in the air. The moment passed as quickly as a blink as the slipstream yoinked her out of the aircraft. The static line ripped her chute from her D-bag. Emily let forth a blood-curdling scream as she fell through the air, her chute furling out above her, and looked down to see her motorbike chutes doing the same. Emily's scream grew in volume as she bounced off the top of her bike's chute, and felt her own chute begin floating down behind her. "My air! Oh, fuck! It stole my air!" Her words were cut short when her own chute caught a stream of air coming around her bikes, and when it inflated, ripped her off the top of the cargo chute. Her chin bounced off her chest as her chute whipped her through the air. She swung as hard as the rest of the canopy filled with air, her body almost making it go horizontal with her swing. Emily, at a loss of what to do, began kicking her feet furiously, as if trying to run on the air and make herself swing the other way. Under the chorus of, "Oh God, oh God, oh God!" she began to swing the other way, finally coming to a level drop a few swings later. Emily looked up, down, around, and clutched the handles on either side of her chute. Below her, the ground was looming, and she began to realize that they were coming down right outside of another airport, just outside their airstrip in a huge grass patch. Her bike began to descend past her, and she remembered what a slip was from the YouTube videos, reaching up and gripping one of her handles to make her slip away from getting her air stolen again. She was about 150 feet from the ground when she noticed something making her way towards her, and saw with disbelief it was a harpy carrying a clipboard in her hand. The big sparrow harpy flapped and hovered with her as she descended, giving Emily a big happy smile as she spoke. "Company, company! Ogledocks Recovery and Survey! Thank you, thank you!" the harpy called out, and swooped back towards the ground, making her way towards the tower building. Emily kind of wanted her to hang around as company, but saw that she was less than 50 feet from the ground now. Emily began to sweat as she tried to remember how the hell to do a paratrooper landing fall, and remembered how to do it right after she thumped into the ground like a sack of manure. The impact caused her teeth to clack together and rattled every bone in her body. But she didn't feel anything snap or break when she impacted the grass. She lay there as the chute fell over her, her chest pumping rapidly up and down, and stared up into the calm of the blue sky. "I did it!" Emily howled, thrusting her fists into the sky. "I did it! I fucking did it! Oh shit!" Her celebration was cut short as the canopy of her chute reinflated, and Emily felt herself drag along the ground. She was quick on her feet and twisted around, scrabbling at the lines of her parachute and dragging it towards her, bundling it as she did. Despite the chute's desire to go sailing into the big blue yonder again, Emily managed to stuff it roughly back into her bag, and slammed the Velcro home in triumph. She heard her bike land behind her with a hollow clunk, and then looked up to see what Muriel was doing. To her horror, she saw Muriel was deliberately swinging herself back and forth on her 2 chutes as if she was a swing, belting out some kind of weird army song as she came towards the ground. With the grace of a veteran, Muriel came down at a swing and landed at a light trot, jogging her way forwards a few feet before bundling away both of her chutes expertly. As Muriel sighed happily and looked at the coffin car flying away in the distance, Emily sat on her rump in the grass, clutching the bundled parachute in her arms. Somehow, some way, she managed to get to the ground alive, and her mind tried to rewind her entire way down. "Emily, did you land on the cargo chute on purpose? That was awesome!" "I did what?" Emily said, confused, and shuffled her thoughts to when she had bounced off her motorbike chute due to it stealing the air from her own chute. Right. Yeah, I wanted to, run along it for fun. Maril liked what she heard, and gave Emily the same rabbit punches in the arm as she did Nadaka. Issue was that Emily was far smaller than Nadaka, and Maril's heavy fist almost caused her to tilt over onto her side. Man, Uncle Doc wasn't kidding about you! He's gonna love this story! Ah ha ha! Yeah. Emily heard flapping again and turned to look over her shoulder, spying another harpy making their way here. This time it was a darker, raven-feathered male, and he handed her a bottle of water while stalking towards Maril. Maril took the dropped log from him and began filling out boxes as Emily chugged the water, hoping to ease the topsy-turvy she was feeling in her guts. After the log was cleared and all the paperwork was in order, Emily and Maril began to untie her motorbike from the deck, as well as shuffling through the small supply crate that was just to the side of her sidecar. Inside the crate was nothing much, mostly spare ammunition, cash assets, and some things for Maril. Everything that Emily needed was inside her sidecar, and she quickly checked to make sure none of her rifles had been damaged in the drop. When everything there was good, she moved on to the bike itself, and wondered if it was feeling as upside down as she was. From inside her breast pocket she could feel her room key humming, and unless she was losing her mind, she swore it felt like it was humming the tune to Free Fallin'. While the key might find it humorous, she did not, and angrily mounted her Zundap. The engine started up cleanly, and nothing was clanking around inside of it. All green lights for Emily. As the motorbike warmed up, Emily heard a cork get pulled out of a bottle, and turned on her heel to see Maril holding another bottle of that foul gremlin fuel that Ndaka had given her before the trip down. She squinted an eye, suspicious, but Maril just waggled the 2 shot glasses and the bottle. The Centaur was smiling widely, and flicked her ears happily. Come on, Emmas. We gotta drink to a happy landing. I don't know about happy, but it was certainly a landing. Emily took the shot glass, and Maril poured it up to the rim, and she gulped the harsh liquor as if it were a drink from the now empty water bottle. Emily found that it tasted foul, no matter what altitude it was drunk. With her Zundap rearing to go, and after Maril had double-checked all 4 of her hoof boots, the duo left the airport at an easy pace, making their way to the bolder Badlands to the south. Maril was wearing her travel helmet somehow, which was more or less a motorbike helmet, and chatted to Emily through the microphone system. Emily learned that Nevada and Arizona were super hotspots when it came to the dimensional clash and the shadow beasts. And all kinds of weird things got up here. Not only was Las Vegas busier than ever due to tourism and other beings wanting to visit the City of Sin, but some things just popped out in the Badlands without even being dragged in by a monster. If anything, objects of power and scraps of machinery just fell out of the damn sky and embedded themselves into the ground. One such object had landed and then activated, rendering half of lower Nevada and western Arizona into a lush forest as it constantly converted the salt water into fresh water. The military had immediately seized the area and began keeping it free of whatever crawled from the water. As the shadow beasts were alarmed at how quickly it churned away their life source, sending waves of things at it in hopes of stopping it from hemming at their domain. Maril noted that you could call this place a war zone, as the trees here seemed odd and the Fae wanted them as well, going back and forth between the Badlands and Las Vegas with things they plucked from the trees and bushes. Uncle Doc always monitored the fluctuations and would send divers down to see if they could snag anything, a job Maril knew all too well. Last time I was here, I found an honest-to-God ray gun that looked like a Thompson submachine gun. Some gangster from a separate dimension had dropped it down a sewer hole on accident and was very happy to get it back, paying us handsomely for doing him a favor. Helped me pay for a few debts I had accrued. Emily thought that she wouldn't mind having a Tommy ray gun of her own, and it would certainly be a hit with her stream followers. And that is Chapter 4, Part 2. Thank you guys so much for watching, and if you liked the video, feel free to like the video, comment, subscribe, or if you really like the video, you can actually send us a little donation via that Ko-fi link in the description below. And if you put my name in it, then I can get a little bit of that donation too. Until next time, This has been Guardbeardia.